Some objects do not survive time by accident. They survive because the truth refuses to die. The crystal chandeliers of the Sterling Legacy Foundation scattered rivers of golden light across the grand ballroom, where Manhattan's most influential philanthropists, entrepreneurs, and civic leaders gathered beneath a ceiling painted with stories of hope and endurance. Every polished marble floor reflected quiet elegance. Every string quartet melody floated gently through the air, and every guest wore the practiced confidence of people accustomed to shaping the world from behind boardroom doors. Nathaniel Sterling stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, his tailored midnight blue tuxedo fitting him with effortless precision. At 48, the white billionaire had long mastered the art of carrying grief without allowing it to interrupt business. His silver-threaded dark hair, calm blue eyes, and measured posture made him appear composed. Yet those closest to him understood that 18 years had passed without a single morning when he failed to remember his late wife, Evelyn. Her absence had become as permanent as the skyline outside the glass, always visible, never spoken aloud. Tonight marked another annual charity gala held in her honor, a tradition Nathaniel had preserved not because it eased his sorrow, but because it reminded him that kindness deserved monuments more lasting than stone. Across the ballroom, conversations softened as a young black woman entered through the east entrance carrying a carefully wrapped velvet case against her chest. She moved with quiet confidence instead of practiced glamour, her deep brown skin glowing beneath the warm lights, while her emerald evening dress reflected understated elegance rather than luxury. At 24, Amara Brooks had built a modest reputation restoring antique jewelry, and although she had received an invitation to display several historical pieces for the Foundation's silent exhibition, she felt unmistakably out of place among billion-dollar donors and celebrated public figures. She smiled politely whenever someone greeted her, yet her attention remained fixed on protecting the priceless family heirlooms inside the velvet case. Nathaniel barely noticed the new arrivals until one subtle movement stopped his heartbeat. As Amara leaned forward to adjust the display stand, a small golden brooch fastened near her left shoulder caught the chandelier's light. The reflection flashed only for a heartbeat, but it was enough. Nathaniel's breathing slowed. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the crystal water glass he had been holding. Every sound inside the ballroom seemed to disappear beneath the rush of memories flooding back without permission. The brooch was unmistakable. A delicate golden magnolia blossom surrounded by tiny blue sapphires, handcrafted nearly 30 years earlier by an artisan in Charleston. Nathaniel had commissioned it as an anniversary gift for Evelyn after she once confessed that magnolia flowers reminded her that grace could survive even the harshest storms. There had never been another piece like it. Never. He remembered fastening it to her coat before their final charity luncheon together. He remembered seeing it sparkle one last time beneath a rainy October sky. He remembered insisting it be buried with her because nothing else felt worthy of accompanying the woman who had transformed his life. His pulse echoed louder than the orchestra. Impossible, he whispered beneath his breath, never taking his eyes off the young woman across the ballroom. The brooch had rested inside a sealed casket 18 years ago. He had watched every handful of earth fall into place with his own eyes. Yet there it was, resting gently on the shoulder of a stranger who looked entirely unaware that a single piece of jewelry had just awakened a secret buried deeper than grief itself. Nathaniel had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without allowing his expression to change, but the quiet tremor in his hand betrayed him now. He placed the untouched crystal glass onto a nearby table before anyone could notice and slowly crossed the ballroom, each measured step carrying him deeper into memories he had spent nearly 2 decades trying to organize into peaceful silence. Around him, conversations continued beneath the soft music, yet every familiar voice faded into the background, as though the magnificent ballroom itself had narrowed into a single destination. Amara was carefully arranging an antique diamond necklace inside a glass display case, wearing the concentration of someone who respected history more than prestige. She did not notice Nathaniel until his shadow settled beside her. She turned with a polite smile that reflected neither nervousness nor ambition. Instead, there was a quiet sincerity that immediately reminded him of someone he had loved beyond words. "Good evening," she said warmly. I hope everything is displayed the way your foundation requested. Nathaniel nodded almost automatically, but his eyes never left the golden brooch resting against the emerald fabric of her dress. Up close, every detail became unmistakable. The tiny sapphire petals, the hand-engraved initials hidden beneath the clasp, even the almost invisible scratch along one edge that Evelyn had laughed about after dropping it during a picnic in Vermont many summers ago. No replica could carry those imperfections. They belonged only to the original. He finally found his voice. "May I ask you something rather unusual?" Amara answered with an understanding smile. "Of course." Nathaniel hesitated, choosing his words with unusual care. "The brooch you are wearing, it is extraordinary. Has it been in your family for a long time?" She instinctively touched the small piece of jewelry, almost as though reminding herself it was still there. "As long as I can remember," she replied. "My grandmother gave it to me on my 21st birthday. She always told me it belonged to someone whose kindness changed our family's future." Nathaniel felt the floor beneath him become strangely uncertain. "Did she ever tell you who that person was?" Amara gently shook her head. "No. Every time I asked, she would simply smile and say that some promises become heavier than memories." The answer lingered between them. Nathaniel studied her face more carefully now. There was nothing calculating in her expression. She spoke without rehearsed emotion, without the slightest awareness that every sentence was reopening chapters of a life he believed had already reached its final page. Across the room, members of the foundation board began calling Nathaniel toward the stage for the opening address, but he barely acknowledged them. His attention remained fixed on the young woman standing before him with remarkable composure. "Would your grandmother still be living?" he asked quietly. Amara nodded. "Yes, she is 81 now. Her health is not what it used to be, but she still remembers every story she has ever told me, except the one behind this brooch." Nathaniel looked once more at the tiny magnolia blossom catching the chandelier light. 18 years earlier, he had buried not only his wife but every unanswered question surrounding that painful autumn. He had accepted that some mysteries belonged only to the past. Yet standing before Amara, he realized the past had never truly disappeared. It had simply waited with extraordinary patience until the right person carried it back into the light. Somewhere beyond the applause rising near the stage, an old promise had quietly begun finding its way home. The applause that followed Nathaniel's opening remarks felt strangely distant, as though he had delivered every carefully chosen sentence from somewhere outside his own body. He thanked the donors, honored the foundation's mission, and spoke about compassion with the same measured confidence that had earned public admiration for years. Yet behind every word another question continued echoing louder than the audience's applause. How had Evelyn's brooch survived the impossible? The gala concluded well after 10 o'clock, but instead of returning to his penthouse overlooking the East River, Nathaniel instructed his longtime driver to take him to Sterling Manor. The historic estate sat quietly on the northern edge of Manhattan, preserved almost exactly as Evelyn had left it. Most rooms had been carefully maintained rather than redesigned, not because Nathaniel refused to move forward, but because certain memories deserved respect instead of replacement. The front door opened before he reached the steps. Margaret Holloway, the family's devoted housekeeper for more than 30 years, greeted him with her familiar gentle smile. At 73, her silver hair and graceful posture reflected a lifetime of quiet loyalty. She immediately sensed something unusual in Nathaniel's expression. "You came here instead of going home," she observed softly. "That only happens when your heart finds something your mind cannot explain." Nathaniel offered a tired smile before walking directly toward Evelyn's private reading room. Nothing inside had changed. Her favorite leather chair still faced the fireplace. Shelves remained filled with biographies, poetry collections, and journals about charitable work across the country. A framed photograph rested beside the window, capturing Evelyn beneath blooming magnolia trees, wearing the very same golden brooch on her cream-colored coat. Nathaniel picked up the photograph with both hands. There could be no mistake. The charity gala. The young black woman named Amara Brooks. The family story. the grandmother who claimed the brooch had been given to them by someone whose kindness changed their lives forever. Margaret listened without speaking, though Nathaniel noticed her hands growing increasingly still. When he finished, she lowered her eyes toward the fireplace. The room filled with the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock that Evelyn had once insisted sounded like a heartbeat, reminding every home to stay alive. "Margaret," Nathaniel said quietly, "you were there the day we buried Evelyn." She nodded. "Yes. You personally placed her keepsakes inside the casket before the ceremony." Another quiet nod. "Then tell me how that brooch is resting on the shoulder of a young woman 18 years later." Margaret remained silent for so long that Nathaniel almost believed she had not heard him. Finally, she looked toward Evelyn's portrait hanging above the fireplace. Her eyes shimmered with emotions she had carefully protected for years. "There is something about that week," she whispered slowly, "that I have carried alone because I believed I was honoring Evelyn's wishes. I promised never to speak unless the right moment finally arrived." Nathaniel's heartbeat quickened. Every unanswered question from 18 years ago suddenly felt closer than ever before. Margaret folded her trembling hands together and drew one careful breath. "Perhaps," she said with quiet sorrow, "the moment has finally found us." Margaret lowered herself into the armchair across from Nathaniel with the careful movements of someone preparing to unlock a room that had remained sealed for far too many years. The fire cast gentle amber light across the reading room, illuminating the portrait of Evelyn as though she were quietly listening to every word. 3 days before the accident, Margaret began, Evelyn insisted on visiting Saint and Community Center without telling anyone from the foundation. She said she wanted to help as herself, not as Mrs. Sterling. Nathaniel frowned. He remembered Evelyn mentioning volunteer visits countless times, but he had never known about one during that final week. Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the emotion gathering behind each sentence. The neighborhood had experienced severe flooding that month. Several families lost nearly everything. Evelyn spent the entire afternoon serving meals, sorting donated clothing, and speaking with mothers who believed no one remembered them anymore. Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment. That sounded exactly like the woman he had loved. She never believed generosity required an audience. Before leaving, Margaret continued, a little girl wandered into the community hall holding the hand of her grandmother. The child could not have been older than 6. She was frightened, quiet, and wearing shoes that were 2 sizes too small. Her name was Amara. Nathaniel slowly lifted his head. The room suddenly felt smaller. Evelyn noticed her immediately, Margaret said with a faint smile. Children always found Evelyn before adults did. She knelt beside the little girl and spent nearly an hour talking with her, coloring pictures, and making paper flowers from old newsletters. I had never seen that child smile until Evelyn made a paper magnolia and tucked it behind her ear. Nathaniel could almost picture the scene unfolding before him. Margaret reached toward the bookshelf where a small wooden keepsake box rested beneath several old journals. She carefully removed it and placed it onto the table. Inside lay dozens of neatly folded thank you notes, faded photographs, and dried magnolia petals preserved between sheets of paper. After everyone else had gone, Margaret whispered, Evelyn asked me to wait outside while she spoke privately with Amara's grandmother. When they finally emerged, both women had been crying, but neither looked defeated. They looked relieved. Nathaniel stared silently at the keepsake box. As we prepared to leave, Evelyn removed the magnolia brooch from her coat. I remember telling her she should not give away your anniversary gift because it meant too much. She smiled at me and said something I have never forgotten. Margaret looked toward Evelyn's portrait once more before repeating the words exactly as she remembered them. She said, "Jewelry only has value when it reminds someone they are loved. If this little flower gives one frightened child hope, then it belongs exactly where it is needed." Nathaniel felt his throat tighten. Margaret continued softly. Amara's grandmother tried to refuse, but Evelyn gently closed the clasp herself and whispered, "One day, someone will ask about this brooch. When that day comes, tell them kindness always finds its way back." The grandfather clock echoed through the room once again. Nathaniel looked from the keepsake box to Evelyn's smiling portrait, realizing that the impossible mystery had only uncovered something even greater. The brooch had never been stolen. It had been entrusted. And somewhere inside that unfinished promise, another truth still waited patiently to be discovered. Sleep never came to Nathaniel that night. Long after Margaret retired upstairs, he remained alone inside Evelyn's reading room while dawn slowly painted pale shades of blue across the windows overlooking the quiet gardens. The keepsake box rested open on the coffee table, surrounded by faded letters, carefully preserved photographs, and handwritten notes that Evelyn had collected over the years. He had believed he knew every chapter of her remarkable life, yet with every document he unfolded, he discovered another act of generosity she had quietly hidden from public recognition. Just after sunrise, Margaret returned carrying a leather-bound journal wrapped in a soft linen cloth. "I almost forgot," she said gently. "Evelyn asked me to keep this safe. She told me it was not meant to be opened until someone finally understood why the brooch mattered." Nathaniel accepted the journal with both hands. The familiar handwriting on the first page immediately transported him back to evenings when Evelyn would sit beside the fireplace recording thoughts she never intended to publish. He carefully turned the pages until one dated entry caught his attention. It had been written only 2 days before her final charity visit. "Today I met a grandmother carrying more courage than resources, and a little girl carrying more hope than certainty. They reminded me that dignity is never measured by what a family owns but by how fiercely they protect one another. If life ever separates me from the people I love, I hope kindness will continue traveling farther than my footsteps ever could." Nathaniel paused, allowing every sentence to settle inside his heart before continuing. Several pages later, he found another entry written after the visit to Saint and Community Center. "Amara smiled today. It was a small smile, but it carried enough light to brighten an entire room. Her grandmother worries constantly about providing stability after losing nearly everything. I cannot solve every hardship, but perhaps I can remind them that they are not invisible. I gave away my magnolia brooch because symbols belong wherever they inspire hope. Nathaniel may not understand immediately, yet one day I believe he will." Nathaniel quietly closed his eyes. For the first time in 18 years, he realized Evelyn had never viewed the brooch as an expensive anniversary gift. She had seen it as an opportunity to comfort someone who needed encouragement more than she needed jewelry. As he continued reading, a folded envelope slipped gently from between 2 pages. Across the front, Evelyn had written only 4 words: "If circumstances allow." Inside rested a photograph Nathaniel had never seen before. Evelyn stood between a smiling elderly black woman and a young Amara, whose tiny hands proudly held a paper magnolia flower. Everyone in the picture appeared genuinely happy. On the back, Evelyn had written another note in careful script. "One family can be born through love. Another can be built through kindness. Never underestimate the second miracle." Nathaniel remained motionless, studying the faces until another detail captured his attention. Behind the 3 figures stood a man speaking with volunteers near the entrance of the community center. His face was partially turned away, but the distinctive silver signet ring on his right hand immediately felt familiar. Nathaniel leaned closer, his heartbeat slowly quickening. He had seen that ring somewhere countless times before. It belonged to someone who had worked closely with the Sterling family years ago. Someone who had always claimed he knew nothing about Evelyn's final charitable projects. Suddenly the photograph became more than a memory. It became evidence that another witness had been standing quietly in the background all along. By 8 o'clock the following morning, Nathaniel was seated alone in the executive conference room at Sterling Foundation headquarters, surrounded by digital archives, storage boxes, and nearly 2 decades of financial records that no one had examined since Evelyn's passing. Sunlight stretched across the polished walnut table while his chief archivist quietly organized folders according to year, foundation project, and legal correspondence. Nathaniel placed the newly discovered photograph beside the computer monitor, his attention returning again and again to the silver signet ring visible on the unidentified man's hand. Memory finally connected the missing pieces. The ring belonged to Charles Whitmore, the Sterling family's longtime legal advisor who had retired 12 years earlier after serving the foundation for more than 3 decades. Charles had handled charitable trusts, estate documents, and confidential records during Evelyn's lifetime. More importantly, he had repeatedly assured Nathaniel that all files connected to Evelyn's independent volunteer work had either been incorporated into the foundation archives or no longer existed. Nathaniel requested every document bearing Charles's authorization. Hour after hour, contracts, donation receipts, and correspondence passed across the table with remarkable consistency until one irregularity quietly emerged. During the month of Evelyn's final community visit, several charitable grants approved in her handwriting had never reached the foundation's annual report. The funds had still been distributed exactly as intended, but the projects themselves had disappeared from every public record, leaving no acknowledgement that Evelyn had personally initiated them. Nathaniel continued reading until another file revealed a handwritten note from Charles recommending that several small community initiatives remain anonymous to simplify future estate administration. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, yet something about the language felt unusually deliberate. Margaret entered the conference room carrying coffee and immediately recognized Charles's signature. Her expression softened with disappointment rather than anger. "He always admired Evelyn," she said quietly, "but he also believed that history should be neat, organized, and uncomplicated. Evelyn never lived that way." Nathaniel nodded slowly before requesting one final archive box that had remained sealed since the estate was settled. Inside rested dozens of photographs from foundation events, volunteer visits, and neighborhood outreach programs. Near the bottom lay another image from Saint and Community Center taken on the very same afternoon as the picture inside Evelyn's journal. This photograph captured a wider angle. Charles stood beside Evelyn while she spoke with Amara's grandmother. His expression was thoughtful, almost conflicted, as he watched Evelyn remove the magnolia brooch from her coat and gently place it into the older woman's hands. There was no confusion, no misunderstanding. Charles had witnessed everything with his own eyes. Nathaniel leaned back in silence as the realization settled over him. Charles had never stolen anything, altered donations, or acted out of greed. Instead, he had quietly erased Evelyn's personal acts of kindness from official history because he believed she would be remembered more favorably through grand foundations than through countless private moments no newspaper would ever report. In trying to preserve her public legacy, he had unintentionally buried the very qualities that made her extraordinary. Nathaniel closed the final folder with measured calm. "He did not hide a crime," he said softly. "He hid a story." Margaret looked toward the morning light spilling across the conference table and answered with gentle certainty. "Stories have a way of surviving longer than silence." Nathaniel reached for his telephone and instructed his assistant to arrange 2 meetings before the end of the week. The first would be with Charles Whitmore. The second would be with Amara Brooks and her grandmother. He no longer wanted reports or archives. He wanted to hear the truth spoken by the people who had lived it, because for the first time in 18 years, Evelyn's greatest legacy was no longer waiting inside old files. It was waiting inside living hearts. 3 evenings later, the main auditorium of the Sterling Legacy Foundation welcomed guests once again. Although this gathering felt remarkably different from the glittering gala held only days before, there were no auction tables, no elaborate floral displays, and no orchestra filling the air with elegant melodies. Instead, community leaders, volunteers, educators, scholarship recipients, and families whose lives had been touched by the foundation sat together without regard for titles or social status. Nathaniel had personally requested that every reserved seat be removed because Evelyn had always believed kindness erased the distance between strangers. Near the front of the room, Amara sat beside her grandmother, Lillian Brooks, whose silver curls framed a face marked by both hardship and quiet resilience. The familiar magnolia brooch rested gently on Amara's shoulder, catching the soft afternoon light pouring through the tall windows. Nathaniel stepped onto the stage carrying no prepared speech, only Evelyn's leather journal and the framed photograph discovered inside its pages. The audience grew completely silent as he looked across the room. "For 18 years," he began calmly, I believed I understood the woman I loved. I honored her through buildings, scholarships, and charitable programs. But sometimes the greatest legacy cannot be measured by what bears a person's name. Sometimes it survives only because another human being chooses to carry it forward. He carefully placed the photograph onto a large display screen where everyone could see Evelyn smiling beside young Amara and Lillian outside Saint and Community Center. A quiet murmur spread through the audience. Nathaniel then opened the journal and read Evelyn's handwritten words exactly as she had recorded them years before. Every sentence about dignity, compassion, and unseen families filled the room with gentle stillness. When he finished, he looked toward Amara. "Would you join me?" She hesitated only briefly before walking to the stage. Nathaniel welcomed her with a warm smile that carried gratitude instead of authority. He invited Lillian to stand beside them as well. Holding the microphone with steady hands, the elderly woman spoke softly. 18 years ago, I had almost stopped believing tomorrow could be different. We had lost our apartment. We had very little money. My granddaughter smiled less each day because children understand fear even when adults try to hide it. Then a woman sat beside us without asking who we were or what we could offer in return. She listened. She encouraged us. Before leaving, she placed this brooch into my hands and told me to keep believing that kindness always comes back when it is shared. Lillian paused, gently taking Amara's hand. That single afternoon gave me enough hope to keep moving forward. Years later, Amara earned scholarships, built a career restoring beautiful things, and never forgot the woman who first restored our faith. Nathaniel reached toward the magnolia brooch with careful respect but did not remove it. "This belongs exactly where Evelyn wanted it to be," he said quietly. "Not inside a vault, not inside a museum, but carried by someone whose life became living proof that compassion continues growing long after the first act of kindness is forgotten by the world." The audience rose to its feet, not because anyone requested applause, but because gratitude often speaks louder than words. Among those standing was Charles Whitmore. With quiet humility, he walked to the front and addressed everyone. "I believed preserving Evelyn's reputation meant protecting only the largest accomplishments. I was wrong. Her smallest moments changed lives in ways no annual report could ever capture." Nathaniel nodded with understanding rather than judgment. At that moment, the room realized the true inheritance Evelyn had left behind had never been wealth, recognition, or elegant foundations. It had always been the courage to make one frightened child believe that tomorrow deserved another chance. The weeks that followed transformed the Sterling Legacy Foundation in ways no strategic plan or board resolution could have predicted. Instead of announcing another ambitious expansion measured by square footage or fundraising goals, Nathaniel introduced a new initiative inspired entirely by Evelyn's quiet philosophy that lasting change begins when people feel seen before they feel supported. The program was named the Magnolia Promise, honoring the small golden flower that had traveled farther than anyone could have imagined. Its mission was simple yet profound. Identify families facing temporary hardship, connect them with practical resources, and pair every financial grant with long-term mentorship so that hope would never disappear after a single generous moment. During the first planning meeting, Nathaniel invited Amara to share her perspective rather than present a resume. She spoke thoughtfully about dignity, explaining that the greatest gift her grandmother had received was not financial assistance, but the feeling that someone believed their future still mattered. Every member of the leadership team listened with unusual attention because her experience carried a truth no consultant could manufacture. When the discussion concluded, Nathaniel quietly slid a folder across the conference table toward her. Inside was an official offer to become Director of Community Partnerships for the Magnolia Promise. Amara looked up with genuine surprise. "There are people with far more experience than I have," she admitted honestly. Nathaniel smiled with calm certainty. "Experience teaches people how to manage programs. Your life has taught you why they matter." The room remained silent for several moments before Amara accepted with grateful humility, promising that every family served by the foundation would be treated with the same respect Evelyn had shown her many years earlier. Lillian watched from the back of the room with tears of quiet joy, recognizing that one afternoon of unexpected kindness had now become an opportunity to help thousands of others. Over the following months, Amara traveled across neighborhoods throughout New York City, meeting teachers, social workers, volunteers, and local organizations that often worked without recognition. She listened far more than she spoke, carefully building relationships rooted in trust instead of publicity. Nathaniel occasionally joined those visits, discovering communities he had previously known only through reports and statistics. For the first time since Evelyn's passing, he no longer felt as though he was preserving her memory alone. He was witnessing it continue through the choices of others. One crisp autumn afternoon, they visited the renovated Saint and Community Center, where children laughed in classrooms filled with sunlight and colorful artwork. The old building had been restored without losing its welcoming spirit. On one wall hung a framed photograph of Evelyn with young Amara and Lillian, accompanied by a simple inscription chosen by the community itself. It read, "One act of kindness can become someone else's beginning." Nathaniel stood quietly before the photograph while children hurried past carrying books and art supplies, unaware that history surrounded them. Amara joined him, gently touching the magnolia brooch resting against her jacket. "She never expected anyone to remember her this way," she said softly. Nathaniel looked around the bright community center, listening to the joyful conversations echoing through the halls. "Perhaps she did not hope to be remembered," he answered. "Perhaps she only hoped kindness would keep introducing itself to people she would never have the chance to meet." Amara smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. In that peaceful moment, neither of them spoke about loss anymore. They spoke only about tomorrow, because Evelyn's greatest inheritance had never belonged to the past. It had quietly become the future of everyone willing to carry compassion one person farther than the day before. Nearly 1 year later, the first morning of spring arrived with the quiet confidence of a season keeping an old promise. Magnolia trees lined the entrance to the newly dedicated Evelyn Sterling Center for Community Hope, their pale blossoms drifting gently through the warm breeze as families, volunteers, educators, and neighborhood leaders gathered for the anniversary celebration of the Magnolia Promise. There were no velvet ropes separating honored guests from first-time visitors. Children ran across the gardens carrying handmade paper flowers, while musicians from local schools filled the air with gentle melodies. The celebration belonged to everyone because the story that had inspired it belonged to everyone as well. Nathaniel walked slowly along the garden path before the ceremony began, pausing beside a bronze sculpture of a blooming magnolia created by a young artist whose education had been supported through the foundation. The sculpture stood not as a monument to wealth, but as a reminder that compassion always leaves fingerprints on the future. Nearby, Amara greeted families by name, laughing with children who proudly showed her drawings they hoped to display inside the community center. She no longer appeared uncertain among leaders and philanthropists because she had never sought their approval. She had earned their respect by treating every visitor with the same kindness once shown to her. Lillian sat comfortably beneath the shade of a magnolia tree, watching generations of strangers become neighbors through simple conversations. Her eyes reflected peaceful gratitude rather than nostalgia because she understood that hope was no longer something borrowed from the past. It had become part of everyday life. As the ceremony began, Nathaniel stepped onto the outdoor stage holding neither speeches nor prepared notes. He looked across the gathering and recognized faces from every chapter of the remarkable journey that had begun with one unexpected encounter at a charity gala. Charles Whitmore sat among volunteers instead of dignitaries, quietly mentoring young nonprofit attorneys committed to serving communities with humility. Margaret smiled from the front row, knowing Evelyn's greatest wish had finally reached the people it was always meant to find. Nathaniel spoke simply. "A year ago I believed I had discovered an impossible mystery. Instead, I discovered that love leaves behind more than memories. It leaves behind responsibilities. Every act of kindness invites someone else to continue the story." He then invited Amara to stand beside him. Without hesitation, she gently unclasped the magnolia brooch from her jacket. The audience watched in complete silence as she placed it inside a beautifully crafted glass display located beneath the sculpture. A small plaque beside it carried Evelyn's own handwritten words reproduced from her journal. Jewelry only has value when it reminds someone they are loved. Nathaniel looked at Amara with quiet understanding. Are you certain? He asked softly. She smiled with peaceful confidence. It never belonged to me alone. It belongs to everyone who needs to remember that one person's compassion can change another person's entire future. Just then, a little girl visiting the center with her mother stopped before the display case, studying the golden magnolia with wide, curious eyes. It is beautiful, she whispered. Amara knelt beside her and smiled exactly as Evelyn once had. Do you know what makes it beautiful? The little girl shook her head. Because someone chose to share it, Amara answered gently. As the child smiled, Nathaniel looked toward the blooming magnolia trees, dancing beneath the bright blue sky, and finally felt something he had not experienced since Evelyn's final spring. It was not the absence of grief, because love never asks us to forget. It was the presence of peace, born from the understanding that the people we cherish never truly leave when their kindness continues walking through the lives of others. And beneath the quiet blossoms, where yesterday's promise had become tomorrow's hope, the story found its truest ending by becoming someone else's beginning.